In the wake of an uncertain succession, England is under threat from the various would-be kings that view its lush farms, rolling hills, and serene forests as nothing more than exploitable territory to commandeer. England has always belonged to the Saxons, of course, who won it by their might in battle against the Wales. At least, that's the mindset for most of the Saxons, including the recently exiled Hereward the Wake. He was forced out of England by the previous king, Edward the Confessor, but fearing the fate of his family, he shall return to his home in the Isle of Ely, where his fate awaits him. That's an interesting story and all, but we're looking in a different direction. Our story today does begin with Hereward. However, there is an alternative to his plans of guerrilla warfare in the fens of England. His loyal knight, Siward, has an interesting plan of his own, and it involves traveling east to the land that any enterprising Germanic adventurer might find work: Greece. Siward envisions a grand destiny for himself across the continent, in a place where he can build up the strength to return to his native land to remove the oppressive Normans from power. He dreams of open fields and lush land where he can make his own prosperity, a new England. Before we get to that though, let's see the story of Hereward and his loyal knights in their task to stop the Norman conquest. When faced with an overwhelming foe, there are two options: to fight or to flight. Don't question the grammar. A difference of just one letter, but a completely opposite outcome. These two options are seemingly mutually exclusive, but are they really? Hereward is quite certain that the Normans, with their haughty Frenchness, would be unwilling to get down and dirty in the fens and fight with him, even if they were willing to send an army to burn down his home in Ely and stick his brother's head on a pike. Hereward's plan is to make England too inconvenient to rule, such that the Normans might leave of their own accord, and he's going to gain support for this plan by meeting up with Duke Edwin of Mercia, where the two would consider their options. While discussing the plan though, news of William's intention to essentially raze to the ground any rebellious region of this new kingdom reached the Saxon Aethelings. The harrying of the north is on, and Hereward's combined fight and flight tactics will have to bring about success soon, lest the whole Anglo-Saxon world be destroyed. Around this time, Hereward would meet Siward of Bamberg, who would initially support his work in the fens, but by December of 1067, Siward offered a solution to the Norman conquest with more of an emphasis on the flight than the fight. There's an offer from Greece that the Anglo-Saxons can escape to Constantinople and live in a new land along the Black Sea. Initially, Hereward scoffed at the idea. Cowardice, that is all this tactic seems to be, but Siward made a promise. He made an oath. One day, brother, I will return, and this land will belong to its rightful owners. This land will be prosperous and Saxon. I don't know how long my return will take, or if it will even happen before God takes me, but when I do return, it will either be to a Saxon kingdom which you've liberated yourself, or it'll be with an army that will restore this land. This I promise you, Hereward. The conviction and ambition in Siward's eyes was convincing. Hereward always knew, in the back of his mind, that a determined man like William the Bastard would win in a situation like this. Every variable is stacked up against the Anglo-Saxons, but Hereward himself is honor-bound to this place by the murder of his family. Siward has no roots here. The two shook hands, and Hereward gave Siward a healthy trove of gold to help him along as he set sail for Europe. The trip to Constantinople, you'd think, would be quite treacherous, but it seems most of Europe is relatively peaceful, as Siward led his entourage through the peace of Western and Central Europe. He did eventually reach Hungary, which he had heard from the Germans would be a dangerous place, but it turns out Hungary is about as calm as the West, and the Danube was a beautiful river to pass by. Siward passed through Wallachia and entered Byzantine territory in October of 1068, and was escorted to Constantinople, where an audience with the Basilius yielded a fork in the road. The Saxons that made it here could either stay in Constantinople as guests of the emperor and make their lives out of whatever they could, or they could travel to the Alan coast, north of the Caucasus. The Basilius believes that the Lord of Zykia might be willing to sell some land to someone with enough money, and Siward did manage to escape with a sizable bit of loot. They chose the opportunity to establish a new realm and then went northeast. Once the Saxons reached Zykia, the enterprising Siward made a deal with them and bought the county there, immediately renaming it to New England. Although when they arrived they stuck to the trappings of a fancy feudal life, it was increasingly clear that this place was far too underdeveloped to be anything more than a sort of subsistence life. So Siward embraced this demotion in prestige to first become tribal, like his neighbors. After some scouts looked to the border of the realm to consider the world around them though, it became increasingly clear that on all sides, New England is surrounded by realms that could easily destroy her. Rather than sit in one place like a meal on a silver platter, Siward made the radical change to his people of uprooting their homes and establishing a mobile home. By complete coincidence, his engineering genius sees him develop what most people would call a yurt, and soon, using some recently tamed wild horses nearby, the New Englanders were ready to live out their lives on the steppes as nomads, ready to fight for survival, and build themselves up until the time to return would come. In case that whole section felt a little bit rushed, by the way, I just want to say that I did all of this in 7 minutes of real time because I'm a Speed 5 fiend, so, you know, probably should have slowed down, but it is what it is. A long time ago, a people of not too distant relation to the Anglo-Saxons migrated to the steppes. The Ostrogoths, who would later settle in the Sevastopol, were not willing to eke out a life on the steppes, unlike Siward and his dedication to success. He has often heard of the power of the squabbling nomads here, and if he can emulate their successes, then building a powerful enough army to challenge the Normans will surely be a simple task. The immediate concern for these New Englanders is avoiding conquest. That will mean packing up and moving to new pastures, but before he could go, Siward met a Jewish refugee that had tagged along during the trek from England to Constantinople. The man urgently requested an audience with Siward, and upon receiving it, told him that he had seen in his dreams a vision of a united England under King Arthur, but he was no Celt, he was a Saxon. And yet, to make the prophecy come true, Siward would have to embrace the Old Testament and reject Christ the Messiah. Well, religions are a little more flexible around this part of the world, so Siward personally converted, and with him did come many of his lesser subjects, but he left the matter of religious belief to each individual. There is no time for squabbles over faith in a place like this. Karaite Judaism and its focus on law and its interpretation is an interesting idea for a lawless place like the steppes. In this land, the only law is the will of the most powerful warlord, and yet the culture of this place is also governed by many unspoken laws. One such law is that those who do not find new pastures are doomed to feed the very grass they cling to. But keeping that in mind, Siward led his people away from the only recently familiar coast of Alania. There's some fertile land to the north, just east of the Dnipro River. However, to claim such land, Siward will have to pay homage to the human Kagan Saru, who would happily crush him and his tiny army if he felt it worth the effort. Looking to keep a low profile, Siward accepted his status as a tributary and paid proper homage to Kagan Saru before setting up the yurts and beginning a new cycle of grazing. There's something beautiful about this place, despite its desolate nature, and although he misses England, Siward is getting more and more used to this land. He had his first son, who he named after himself, in March of 1075, and after a few more years of grazing, he moved once again, but not too far. To his directly western border, there's another humble herder he can chase off the land, and right after doing so, he demanded back the land he had just left behind, giving him control over 2 patches of grazing land. Already, Siward's power is growing. That old law about the will of the most powerful warlord would come to test Siward's men though, as for the first time so far in the steppes, Siward must face a hostile force. Raiders from a vassal of the Cumans came to take what they could, and they were mounted on fast horses with expert riders. Despite their seeming advantage thanks to the cavalry, the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls were able to use their expertise with throwing axes to take the horses out from under these riders and then go in for the kill. The steppes are a savage place, but even the local nomads were unprepared for this sort of martial vigor. The invading Cumans were slaughtered, and in response the Kagan sent a letter to Siward. Strength is meaningful and respectable, and of course, the Kagan would be remiss to punish someone for defending their land, but to be accepted in this land, Siward would have to embrace Tengrism. While the pressure to convert wasn't too high, it felt wise to try and blend in better with the local Khans, lest they gang up on this new Anglo-Saxon horde. To Siward, the heart of Anglo-Saxon culture is not necessarily an attachment to Christianity, and that prophecy that he received from that Jewish person was probably nothing, to be honest. Siward instead hopes to maintain Anglo-Saxon institutions like the Witan and the system of Huscarls, guarding their thanes and lords. After all, if they become too different and accept too much change, their return to England may very well become an invasion. To help get an edge on his neighbors, Siward will need money and men. The best way to get both is to do a great hunt, which the locals call a nerga. The goal is to hunt a huge collection of animals whose meat can be variously used as food for the winter, sold for gold, or offered up as gifts. It's a little different than the sport hunting that the Saxons do in England, as the goal here is not to find one particular animal and track it, but to instead corral a large group of animals into one area where they can all be slaughtered en masse. The chaos of this style of hunt can lead to some injuries though, as Siward was attacked by a wild bird on the hunt. He was injured, but believed he would pull through. That was, until the injury worsened sometime after the hunt, and Siward called for a physician to try and keep himself alive. He's only 43, and he's still got a promise to keep to his ally Hereward. The doctor did what he could, and assured Siward that although his existence will not be pleasant during this time of healing, he would in all likelihood survive. Nonetheless, the Nerga was a success, and with the wealth from the pelts they were able to sell, the Saxons created many regiments of Huscarls, who would ultimately be put to use in a raid on the Russians. Despite their small numbers, these powerful men in heavy armor ripped the mostly untrained levies of the Russians to shreds, but upon returning home, they saw that an opportunistic Khan, in fact the very same one from the last raid, Kubasar the Bald, was raiding their homes. This is the way of the steppes. Show vulnerability and be punished for it at every turn. Despite this minor setback, the Russian raid was a success, and with the riches of the Slavic forests, Siward was able to establish himself as a more dominant ruler. His wound was also improving, and with it the pain of the injury. Siward took the opportunity to show his son, also named Siward, the dangers of this land. Even a small bird can put a man down if he's not careful. Regardless, the fertility of this land has dried up, so it's time to migrate again. The pastures of New England will surely have replenished by now, so using the same route they took to get to the steppes, the Saxons will return to Alania. Siward is starting to get the hang of this whole nomadic thing. The horses are grazing and growing strong, and another successful Nerga has enriched the yurt. Not all is so happy though. Along the way, Siward the Younger, still only a child, caught a bad case of consumption, and the harsh conditions of the migrating convoy made it impossible to care for him properly. Nonetheless, the mission must go on, and Siward continued to gather his strength, raiding the mountain kingdom of Georgia and considering his next moves. He doesn't intend to stay here in the steppes if he doesn't have to, but how much power must he amass to take on the Normans back home? It's hard to know how powerful William and his descendants might be without taking the chance to head home, but if he waits too long, he may not live to see the day. Important thoughts for sure, and considering that he may indeed soon pass on, he would start spending time with his surviving son, Eadwig. He must be raised in the ways of war and trained to handle the yurt when his time is right. It's also important that he know the purpose of this mission. Don't get too adapted to the steppes. The legendary land of England, which Eadwig has never seen before, must be reclaimed. After finishing up the raid on Georgia, Siward demanded that the kingdom pay him a tribute to prevent further raids, hoping the recent example might inform them of the consequences of their refusal. They did refuse nonetheless, and so Siward went to war. The Georgians believed that, like the usual steppe nomad barbarians, Siward's army would be composed of mostly cavalry that can't handle the terrain here, but when Siward marched up with rugged Huscarls clad in heavy armor and wielding massive axes, it was a paralyzing sight. The Georgians were quickly overrun and made to pay a tribute. To try and smooth things over in the long term and try to assure Georgian obedience, Siward used the carrot instead of the stick. He invited King Georgi to a feast in his honor. There was genuine merriment and the hope of a long-term tributary relationship, but Siward was looking to set up further sources of revenue for his eventual reclamation of England. Beyond the Caucasus sits the Roman Empire, which had so generously taken the Saxons in previously. There's something to be said for showing gratitude, but the steppes have had their mark on Siward. The weak ought to be exploited by the strong. It might sound preposterous to challenge the mighty Roman Empire and to demand a tribute payment from the riches of Constantinople, but to be bold is the way of the Saxons. It's how they conquered England, and it's how they'll reconquer it too. To start the war, Siward led his men to the Greek outpost of Kerch, where the Roman Empire projected its power outwards to the rest of the steppe. The overconfident Byzantines, seeing this as nothing more than a raiding party or some strange madman maybe, hastily landed their men at Kerch looking for a quick fight, but they were met with ferocious Huscarls and a rain of arrows from mobile archers. This army operated similarly to the Varangian guards, but with the focus of mind and strength of the steppe peoples. The emperor's army was annihilated and Kerch left to burn, while Siward moved on towards Chersonesus, the heart of Greek settlement on the Black Sea. They quickly took the city and laid a trap. Siward led his men away from the occupied city to appear as if it were undefended, but told his men to keep a slow pace and save their energy for an upcoming sprint. Once the Byzantines and some allies of theirs landed, the army marched at double speed to reach the city before the Byzantines could reclaim it, or worse, retreat somewhere out of reach. While the Byzantines were cautiously sieging the barely manned walls of Chersonesus, the Anglo-Saxon army arrived and destroyed the Roman army for a second time, sending their heads back to Constantinople with an accompanying demand. The Byzantines must pay tribute, or else their entire empire will be ravaged by raids and destruction on a scale far beyond what they've ever seen before. The heads were an appropriate accompaniment and worked wonders as the Romans replied in turn with a trove of gold and a treaty stamped with the Basilius' wax seal. The humble Saxon refugees on the steppe have bent the knee of the Romans and extracted from them unfathomable wealth, and yet, for some reason, they are still paying tribute to the Cumans, who claim overlordship of the western steppe. What a ridiculous notion. Siward immediately sent word that he would be ending any tribute to the Cumans on account of his proven strength against the Romans, but Khagan Saru, now known as the Wolf, would not let his conquering claws out of the Saxons easily. A war of retaliation kicked off immediately, and Siward was happy to prove his mettle again. The duplicitous Romans, hearing that there was an outbreak of war between their subjugators and the most powerful steppe empire of the West, chose to immediately void their own treaty, promising tribute, expecting that Siward would be too occupied to do anything about it. They thought wrong. Siward, the subjugator of the Romans and the challenger of the Cumans, will fight the two great empires that stand between him and the lordship of the steppes. Not that he wants to rule this barren land, really. This won't be easy. By seizing on his quick-to-mobilize armies, Siward was able to occupy a few border counties held by Saru and get off to a strong start. The siege of Timur-Tarakan was interrupted by a strange Byzantine naval force that was attempting to land at the port there. They must have just not noticed the massive Saxon army there, and their entire force was obliterated. With a field of dead Greeks before them, the Saxons moved on to Kerch and Chersonesus again. Despite having just taken those cities a very short period of time earlier, the garrisons there refused to surrender without a siege. After taking those cities, Siward left to continue the fight against Saru, where he occupied another border county and kept the pressure on the Khagan, who, as of yet, has not actually sent any forces to fight. It was perhaps Saru's misjudgment that the very threat of a Cuman intervention would put Siward in his place, but the foreigners showed immense boldness to challenge the Gurkhan like this. There can be no response to that kind of boldness beyond respect and understanding. Siward sent in an offer of peace, affirming that he will not pay tribute, but allowing Saru to be the one to sever the relationship, saving him face. The letter arrived just as Saru had sent his men to attack Siward's yurt, and he could have taken the opportunity to win the war, but hearing of Siward's absolute dominance against the Greeks, Saru lost some of his nerve. This all felt a little too much like a trap, and he decided not to call the bluff. A white peace was signed in October of 1095, breaking Siward free of his obligations to the Cumans and allowing him to focus on the Greeks. Using the exact same strategy as what he used previously, Siward was able to defeat the Romans after they took an ill-advised amphibious battle at Chersonesus in December of the same year. For his feeble attempts to escape his own treaty, Basilius Manuel was forced to immediately pay a lump sum of over 1,000 pieces of gold and to continue paying his regular tribute payments under threat of total destruction if he should fail to do so. To step outside of the roleplay for a moment here, if you're wondering how I can do so well in these battles, the secret is to declare war on the Byzantines and let them do amphibious landings on you. The recent landing penalty is a -30 to your advantage count, and I have the game rule for 10% bonus damage per advantage point on, meaning these advantage points make a huge difference. Getting tribute from the Romans is pretty easy when they throw themselves at you like a wet noodle, quite literally. Using the wealth of the Romans, Siward assembled a massive army of heavy horse archers and foot archers, and then he browsed the dungeons looking for skilled knights and commanders he could use to potentially dominate the steppe. He's unveiled, at least to himself, if not the whole region, the weakness of the Cumans, and that means it's time for them to genuflect before the true lord of the steppes. Well, Siward was thinking about it, but then he realized that there's a bit too much to lose, and that Saru will surely treat him as an equal now, right? Being treated as an equal means facing off against the full, true might of the Cuman Khagan. That sounds unwise. Instead, Siward invested his tributary payments from the Romans into his yurt, and into proper siege engines, which he purchased from Constantinople in February of 1101. These mangonels will make any makeshift nomad palisade into kindling with little effort. He was considering incorporating some kind of heavy cavalry either from Georgia or Greece. The cataphracts and the Manaspa are a similar unit, but one is suited to mountains and the other to flatland. The thing is, none of them are well suited to the dry, desolate steppes, and so neither are really as wise a choice as the relatively common horse archer or lancer. While considering these choices, Kagan Saru, the wolf of the steppe, passed away. Siward had grown to respect the powerful Kagan, and part of him wanted to try and help his son keep the throne that he rightfully inherited, but on the steppes, nothing is for free. Siward considered declaring war on the new Kagan, Saru II, a mere teenager I should add, with the goal to make of him a tributary. Tribute the Kagan will pay, but protection he may also receive. Protection he will need, especially looking at all the hungry vultures circling this Kagan's corpse, in light of its great ruler's death. At least, that was his idea, but the Witan advised Siward to be cautious. Some, cowards we might call them, were wary of more bold moves like these. They'd just taken down the Roman Empire and had found themselves on equal footing with the Gur-Khan. Maybe they're right. Siward watched over the border as Saru II scrambled to keep his empire together, and in turn Siward did not interfere. He went hunting and tended to his herd, which was growing steadily. He used the herd for many construction projects and to assemble a great army which numbered nearly 4,000 by November of 1104. It already seems like the retired life was something Siward really needed, as he hadn't realized he was already in his 60s and was falling apart. He'd given everything to his people and to his dream of returning to England, but he wouldn't live to see it come true. He knew he was dying, and so spoke to the Witan, or Kurultai as the local Khans might call it, and declared that the fight does not die with him. Siward raised his son Eadwig to rule rightly and to carry on the mission. The Witan must support him, or else they will all perish to infighting and chaos. The Witan respected Siward's words, but the moment he died, Eadwig's jealous brother, Ethelgar, expressed discontent with the choice to let Eadwig rule. The clamor was silenced quickly when Eadwig asserted that he is the king, more importantly that he is not soft like his father. Eadwig was born on the steppe, molded by it. Siward proved himself to the steppe, and for that he would always be respected, but Eadwig is native to this place now. There is no mercy for disloyalty, disobedience, or anything which might go against the will of the king. The Witan? What do they matter? It's time to take these disunited steppes and create out of them enough of a herd that the Normans will wish they never landed in England. Let's talk a little about Eadwig. He's a product of life on the steppes in many ways. His martial education is derived mostly from experience and from hunting, more so than real combat, leaving him perhaps more confident than his skills would portray. Nonetheless, he is a brave and just man. Justice on the steppes, though, is little more than an appeal to power, and as such he highly values power projection. His education from his father, which emphasized the return to England and the return to settled life, is at odds with his steppe upbringing. He's caught between worlds, but his world is indeed entirely the desolate sea of grass he was born in. He grew up following the shamanic practices of the Turks, despite some secret Christian teachings from his father, and he even had to learn both the way of the Saxon shield wall and the horseback archery harassment techniques emblematic of this land. Because of this, he's a fickle man with a split identity. The test of his character is whether or not he can compromise these worlds into a powerful identity that surpasses both. If he fails to do so, he may find himself a combination of all the worst aspects of his respective upbringings. At least, that's what others might think of him. In truth, Eadwig isn't so pensive, he's a little more direct, and that directness will immediately present itself as a war against the humans. While his father, Siward, may have had some kind of strange reverence for the humans and their rulers on account of some strange elderly wisdom that escapes Eadwig, he has no such reverence himself. The humans are collapsing, and it's time to pounce. Rather than risk biting off more than he can chew, Eadwig is first going to just conquer one border county, the county of Basinda. He wants to see what resistance the humans can put up in their weakened state, so that he can evaluate if a war to completely subjugate this dying empire is on the table. The Kagan, Asep, brother of Saru II, who was killed in the chaos of his unending civil wars, put up no resistance against Eadwig, seeing him as a low priority, until the army marched up to the Volga River. Seeing an army across the river, ready to fight, Asep had to respond, so he attacked into the marshes of Astrakhan to disastrous results. The marshes are no place for horses, which Eadwig knew, hence he put his huscarls there, who, while also impeded by the marsh, weren't as hindered at all. The battle was a total decimation, and then the army besieged the Cuban capital, earning a victory but demanding little. It seems quite clear that the Cumans are a little more than a twig on the ground for Eadwig to march over. In good time, the whole of the steppes will obey his will. Before getting too focused on the outside world, the Saxon king has to spend some time on his own realm. There are animals to hunt, Kurultai members to intimidate, and animals to tend to. Eadwig was, nonetheless, excited to get back to war. His truce was short, thanks to the small scale of the previous war, and in June of 1110 he declared war on Steppe again, this time intending to bring the Cumans into a tributary relationship with the Saxons. Similarly to the Byzantines, who haven't dared break their tributary agreement after the devastating defeats they experienced, the Cumans are more valuable as a source of herd than they are directly conquered land. The cowardly Cumans were still focused on destroying each other, and as such, Steppe was killed and replaced with his only recently born son, Sutoi, December, and the completely unguided armies of Cumania utterly failed to even organize against the Saxon incursion. Eadwig occupied all the land up to the Volga River and crossed it to take the capital of the empire, and then marched west to take the land between the Don and the Volga rivers, before enforcing his tributary demands on the Cumans, who had no choice by this point. The era of the Cumans is over. Looking to maintain his control over Cumania indirectly through this little kid, Eadwig did choose to join the wars that the Cumans were fighting so that their stability would allow for greater tributary payments. Constant civil wars otherwise would have disrupted the steady flow of herd back to Saxon grazing land. One of these wars isn't actually a civil war though. It turns out the Khitans of Great Liao and the Far East, with whom Eadwig was only vaguely familiar, are vying for control over the Cumans too. Everyone is picking at the Khaganate's corpse. The Great Liao are, in theory, a fearsome opponent, but they probably aren't used to fighting Saxons and might be taken by surprise. It's a long march east, but Eadwig is pretty curious to meet these mysterious Easterners. He'd find the Liao army, sieging small fortresses in the Ural Mountains, and among the soldiers there, Saxon scouts spotted the Khitan Khagan himself. Hongji II was captured in the ensuing battle, which was of course won by the Saxons, and thanks to that, the Cumans won their war, providing them some stability after a long time in conflict. Anglo-Saxon influence now spreads from Rome to nearly the entire western steppe, but it's not quite enough for the ambitious Anglo-Saxon. The Oghuz tribes around the Aral and Caspian seas once were Cuman tributaries who have since broken free. They will be returned to the fold. I'd have more to say about these wars, but by this point the Saxon army is, although not immensely huge, composed of such well-disciplined men with high-quality weapons and armor that nothing can stop them right now. Yet, no amount of success can ever fix personal issues like family. Eadwig has so clearly taken on the mantle of Lord of the Steppes, which he inherited from his father, that his brother from years ago that whined about not getting a share of the realm would return to once again whine and complain. Ethelgar demands a share of the realm, whether in the form of grazing land or some horses. Had this pathetic excuse for a man not been a direct blood relative, Eadwig would have killed him there, but instead he sent his insolent brother into exile, where he might find a life more appropriate for his station somewhere else. Instead of wasting his time on his brother, Eadwig turned to his son, Hakon, who is growing into quite the talented boy. The boy took to horseback riding quickly and showed a sharp mind, only limited by his seemingly docile attitude. He's maybe too compassionate for the steppes, but if Eadwig has his way, this boy won't have to live in the steppes. After all, Eadwig is honor-bound by his father to return to England eventually. Either way, the realm entered a period of peace from here, as the immense tributary states that Eadwig established are fattening up his herd and his coffers. He spent his Roman coins on attending university in Constantinople, looking to refamiliarize himself with the fighting styles of the settled peoples. It would be truly shameful if this Saxon king returned to England and got kicked back into the sea. He's been told that England is a land of hills, forests, and valleys, which are quite different from the harsh, rugged mountains and vast, unending flatlands that make up the steppes. After wrapping up his studies in Greece, Eadwig returned home and got to administrating all the tribute he's receiving. He'll need to work hard to make sure every bit of rightfully extracted tribute is accounted for and put to use. He's generating a truly immense amount of both wealth and herd right now, but if he gets lazy, then the tributaries might think they can get away with sneakily paying less than what they owe. As was expected though, the Cumans did enter yet another civil war, which Eadwig would step in to solve. Whenever the Cumans enter a civil war, their tribute is, of course, reduced, and worse yet, Eadwig has to get his own herd killed to deal with the rebels for his little subject. On the upside, he can capture prisoners and ransom them for a compensation of herd that might, hopefully, outpace his losses. In May of 1121, Eadwig was able to assert his dominance and potentially extend his direct control over the steppes significantly, but in truth, this system of tribute works perfectly fine for him. He did become the king of the Caucasus in September of that year, if only so that he could bask in the glory of being a proper king, as opposed to a mere petty king, or, as some have derisively called him, a mere high chieftain. Seeking further tribute, Eadwig declared war on the nascent kingdom of Syria, ruled by the ambitious Abd al-Wahid. He's rich, he's powerful, and he owes tribute to someone even more rich and even more powerful. The Syrians were so busy fighting other wars that Eadwig actually won the war without fighting a single battle. His Byzantine siege equipment made short work of the Arab fortresses, and as such, any conquest the Syrians make in the future will have a share of their spoils brought up north to New England. Obviously, Eadwig's authority is unparalleled, and yet it is the way of the steppes that some uppity lord will try to stop a new Gur Khan from getting too dominant. Hongji II, who Eadwig met briefly after putting him in a dungeon, has declared war to take over the tributaries that he feels are rightfully his. He already lost once, why would he possibly think he can win now? Eadwig's realm is quite small, and that might sound bad, but what it means is that there's very little land to protect. He'll just sit in his mountain home and wait until the Khitans of Liao arrive. He can fight them after they've just marched for months, and he can have the home advantage. This is exactly what happened when the Khitans arrived in Carvadinia and were immediately caught out and slaughtered. Maybe this was only a scouting force considering its size, but it was more like a tiny snack as far as Eadwig's hunger for war goes. The war would end inconclusively when Hongji's embarrassing defeat resulted in his own tributaries abandoning him, making his war to claim Cuman tribute pointless as they no longer shared a border. Using the grandeur of his new kingdom, Eadwig is enjoying some of the trappings of settled life. He's spending his lavish tribute payments to sponsor the makings of thrones, crowns, chests, pots, and whatever else that his talented courtiers claim to be able to make. By July of 1132, Eadwig has acquired enough experience as a commander that he understands both sedentary and nomad tactics. He's quite the military genius thanks to his time being educated at Constantinople and work on the steppes. Now he needs to live long enough to make his invasion of Norman England. A focus on medicine and health should help give him the longevity to make it west. Unfortunately, with a focus on health came the poetic justice of death. A plague, presumably spread by some careless tribute caravan, assaulted New England. Eadwig, his wife, and his children all caught the measles, and the Witan immediately started up discussions on the successor for the kingdom. Eadwig's son, Siward, was the first to be taken by the measles, as the doctor tried to help him but only left his face disfigured. In fact, even Hakon, the older son, would have his face disfigured, but he was at least having an easier time surviving the deadly pox. Eadwig's wife would survive, although her face too was left too scarred to look at. Most impressively though, Eadwig himself, despite being nearly 50 years old, did survive the measles and put the Witan to silence about succession. This king is too powerful to be taken down by a couple rashes. Hakon also survived the plague, meaning the succession should be safe, although the poor man did lose his face just like his mother. With the plague over, the realm resumed its normalcies, including the sponsoring of every crafter available. Why Eadwig sponsored so many things is hard to say, but maybe it's because he's trying to understand the settled life in preparation for his adoption of it. In 1140, while tending to his regular duties, Eadwig was approached by a Muslim imam of the Muwalladi school, who told Eadwig that he's a prophesied spreader of Islam, that if he embraces Islam, he'll have greater support from across the massive Muslim world. This is where Eadwig's somewhat lacking education with regards to religious matters in general comes into play. He may be Tengri, but Tengrism is essentially an entirely Turkic and Mongolic way of seeing God. The oral tradition isn't even in a language he can speak. Perhaps he'd have been Christian if his father had paid more attention to faith, but at this point, Islam at least seems more organized and sophisticated than Tengrism, so he embraced it, without knowing exactly how much animosity the Muslims and Christians of Europe have for each other. Using the additional herd he's acquired from the Turks of the Western Steppe, Eadwig has expanded his dominance once more, becoming the absolute power of the Western Steppes in October of 1143. It's well known that he intends to only stay temporarily, so the entire region is eagerly awaiting the immense chaos that will ensue whenever the Saxons do board their ships and set sail to England. For whatever reason, the Byzantines felt they could try and break free from paying their tribute, but I mean, what were they thinking? Of course Eadwig would put them back in their place immediately and reclaim that valuable revenue source. But beyond that, he is preparing for his trip to England. He needs a navy, and he needs the courage to give everything here up, so he can pursue a land that he's never even seen. To get his men ready for the great battle ahead, he hosted a grand tournament full of tests of martial skill. This is the last preparation he'll take before the Odyssey to the west. Eadwig himself participated in the duels and even managed to win after outing a cheater that supposedly beat him. Afterwards though, Eadwig's advanced age saw him become too frail to wrestle. He'd sit out the following competitions, and afterwards the nature of the tournament put on in full display the divergences in tradition that have slowly but surely come to the Anglo-Saxons of New England. The New Englander culture is communal and focused on hunting and horsemanship. The role of the Witan has also been significantly reduced with the rise of the Kurultai, but of course the Huscarls are still an important pillar of this culture. The empire of the New English has become the greatest of the realms on the steppe. The dream has been achieved, and the High King Eadwig, known as the Wolf Slayer for his role in the destruction of the Cuman Cognate, is ready to sail the seas. It's time to return to England. The Normans in England received a curious declaration of war signed by one Eadwig of New England from the far-off steppes. If not for the subjugation of the Romans, they likely wouldn't even know who this Eadwig is. The Norman king, William III, is well aware of Eadwig and his fierce reputation, but it is assumedly exaggerated, as all these haughty steppe lords are. Maybe the Romans are weak, but the Normans are not. Regardless of this perception, the New Englanders are arriving sooner rather than later. A great fleet sailed the Mediterranean and went through the Straits of Gibraltar before wrapping around past the White Cliffs of Dover and up to East Riding, where the English capital has been relocated. The Norman army was waiting and ready, but they had no clue the extent of their inadequacy in the face of these hardened nomads. The Normans had been mismanaging their kingdom for decades now, but foolishly saw themselves as inherently superior nonetheless. The king was captured in battle and forced to give up the kingdom immediately. All Norman land was confiscated, and the New Englanders landed in Winchester, ready to embrace their long-lost brothers. What was unnerving about this seeming liberation, though, was the star and crescent atop each ship, and the Arabic-speaking religious leaders that were blessing the arriving settlers. Winchester, and the land around it, after having been vacated of Normans, became the center of New English culture and the center of Islam in Britain. Eadwig, now calling himself a Sultan instead of a king, has the right to distribute the confiscated Norman land as he sees fit. As such, he prioritized his own family and then handed land out to the loyal knights he'd relied on for his conquests. He even landed his friend Bjortmare the Wolf, whose nickname you'd think would imply that he was actually killed by Eadwig the Wolf Slayer, but don't worry about it. Bjortmare is a Tengri, low-born Saxon, and putting him in charge of any English land is certainly a choice on the part of the Sultan. Muwallad-e-Islam is a very adaptive and tolerant branch of Islam, and as such, things should be fine, but it's a little disquieting for the local Catholic population. The question has immediately become whether or not these New Englanders are really liberators or just new conquerors. Eadwig is emphasizing that he has come to emancipate the Saxons, and that although he professes a foreign faith, no one will be made to convert, nor will they face persecution for their faith. This sort of tolerance is certainly a trait he inherited from his time on the steppes, but it seems to be working. The Sultan speaks Anglic and seems to indeed be one of us in the eyes of the local Saxons, even if the interest in horses is a bit curious. Beyond these domestic affairs, Eadwig has conquered a kingdom so terribly mismanaged that the pearl of the kingdom, London, has fallen into the hands of some upstart peasant lady. Duchess Fruizza of Essex is an Italian that seemingly just kind of popped up here. No traceable family, no ties to the land. Who knows how this happened, but the Normans must have just forgotten to take any records or chronicles or anything of the like. To be fair to them, Fruizza is quite the elusive shadow. Regardless, she will be conquered and her land returned to the kingdom. London was easily taken and granted to Bjornwulf Longshanks, also a Tengri New Englander, and then Eadwig went to conquer York from the Scots. As a ruler from the steppes, these settled lords are quite frankly so hilariously underpowered that it's almost unsporting to defeat them. At the very least, it goes to show that Eadwig had in fact succeeded in bringing the warlike aspect of his steppe upbringing into himself. That martial prowess would continue as he invaded Ireland, looking to subjugate the entire kingdom there. The Irish have famously been very skilled at defending their homes and fighting fiercely against invaders, but they've never known an enemy like this. After landing in Dublin and destroying the Irish army, the kingdom surrendered. Some of the local Irish lords were allowed to keep their land, while Dublin and its hinterlands were granted to more New Englander knights as rewards for their work. Eadwig is realizing that, with how easy these wars are, he can probably unite the entirety of the British Isles. He's got a truce with the Gaels of Scotland, but once that's up, he can probably invade them with ease. Even the Welsh are like ants beneath his foot. Unfortunately, he's quite old, so he might not live to see United Britain. Between truces, Eadwig focused on building up the castles of his domain. He's not used to the settled life, but the local Saxon magistrates are quite happy to explain to him and his immense trove of wealth exactly how the settled life works. This hoard of cash will run out eventually if Eadwig can't secure a new income, and his success or failure in this aspect could be what makes or breaks the longevity of his line. No longer are livestock the source of power, but now gold is. After about a decade of rule, the New England settlers have slowly spread throughout the kingdom, intermingling with the local Saxons and coexisting quite well. The policy of tolerance espoused by the Sultan has led to a kingdom of people that, while perhaps wary of each other, have trust that life can be peaceful and assured by a fair justice system. Nonetheless, the Catholic priests, bishops, and general hierarchy of the kingdom do not appreciate that Canterbury is ruled over by a Muslim imam right now. Hitting his 80s, Eadwig is looking to cement his legacy, and he was considering what exactly he could point to as a uniting factor between himself and his Celtic, Saxon, and Brythonic subjects. What unites all inhabitants of this island is, of course, the legacy of King Arthur. Arthur was a Welsh king, in truth, and as such you'd think only the Welsh would revere him, but he's more of a legendary figure that symbolizes the entire region. Focusing in on that, Eadwig proclaimed that he was the inheritor of Arthur's legacy, through that prophecy that his father Siward had received all that time ago from the Jewish Saxon, and asserted that he would soon be Sultan of all Britain, although his frail body could barely do these things without a coughing fit. Through sheer force of will did this old man continue to cling to life, much to the chagrin of his middle-aged son Hakon, who was hoping he might eventually get a turn on the throne. The final invasion of Scotland began in July of 1167, and as expected, they would surrender their entire kingdom over after just a few months of sieges and battles. With Scotland conquered, there remains only a small holdout of Welshmen in central Wales, but Eadwig is ready to declare himself the High King of Britain, which he did on April 4th of 1168. He then conquered the last Welsh holdouts and considered the fact that, well, his economy is not improving. The trove of gold he's been using to fund his realm and his campaigns is slowly running out, and what's worse, a crusade has just been announced for England. This crusade, you'd think, would make the Catholic Saxons potentially join against their Muslim lords, but these crusaders are bringers of war, destruction, pillage, and death. They are foreigners looking to subjugate England again. Never again will the Saxons be ruled by foreigners after the trauma of the Norman harrying. The Crusaders arrived near Hampshire in May of 1171, and after being annihilated, the remaining Crusaders landed instead in Cornwall, hoping to use the forested terrain there to catch out the Saxon cavalry. Unfortunately, the forests are the perfect terrain for the Huscarls, who are all too happy to lay waste to these Crusaders. In November of that year, the previous Pope, Innocentius, died in Rome, replaced by a much more diplomatic Pope, Eugenius. The death of the Pope signaled the end of the Crusade, and also signaled that Eadwig had one last year of life left in him. The success of the Crusade saw the legend of King Arthur spread across the Isles, and with his limited remaining life, Eadwig completed the legend in September of 1172. A few months later, he passed away, giving his throne to Hakon, who is already nearly 60. Hakon has just one goal: to fix the economy. Eadwig's unfortunate focus on his steppe half meant he failed to establish a proper economy. He refused to reduce the size of the army or to invest his war chest in the land. The realm has been split between the High King Hakon and his brother King Guthfrith, who has claimed Ireland and Alba, which he rules from his domain in Mercia. There was immediate resistance to Hakon's rule, as the realm saw that without money, Hakon's rule might not be long for this world. As a proper Tengri New Englander though, Hakon is more than happy to meet his enemies on the field. He won a few engagements and occupied some land, but keep in mind that he has no money, and these enemies are indeed his match, even they too are from the steppes. The war ended in white peace, despite the fact that Hakon was probably in deep trouble. Hakon is also in trouble because, quite frankly, he's just so damn old, and he only has daughters. It's quite likely he won't be able to have any more kids before his death, and so his brother, Guthfrith, will probably be the next High King. To help keep the realm stable, Hakon did convert to Muwaladism, hoping that he might be able to continue the policy of tolerance his father had done, but most saw it as a half-hearted political conversion, which it was. Hoping to leave at least some kind of mark on the realm, Hakon was able to stabilize the treasury if only by shrinking his army, a sad compromise, and he also wanted to secure his cultural legacy. Integrating the Welsh culture into his own New Englander culture, Haakon declared that he was neither Saxon, nor Celt, nor Welsh, but instead, he is the inheritor of King Arthur's legacy via his father and grandfather. He is an Arthurian High King, which is a cultural movement that seeks to combine all the best aspects of the cultures of the island. For this, he took the name Siward after his grandfather and the prophesized Pendragon, and the title of Pendragon itself after Arthur himself. He even changed up the colors and emblems of the empire, choosing the name Alba for this new land. These sweeping reforms included the renaming of England to Wolgear, a Welsh name for the land, and Scotland to Pictland in reference to the ancient warriors that lived there long ago. As one last act of dominance, Haakon, now called Siward, took his army to Normandy. No matter how much it will cost the treasury, the Normans must be punished for their nearly century-long tyranny over Wolgear. The Duchy of Normandy was conquered easily, although the House of Normandy continued its rule over Flanders, even taking the title Prince of England, despite their total illegitimacy. Siward continued his rule until November of 1182, at which point he died after ruling for 10 years. His brother Guthfrith took the throne, a 31-year-old man. His rule would of course be challenged, but thanks to the economy set up by his brother, he was able to fight off the challengers, and in celebration, he went on a hunt. There hadn't been a proper grand hunt here in England for a long time, and it's a critically important tradition for these people that they hunt. A successful hunt it was, followed by a great feast, and from here, the prosperity of Alba would surely continue for good. The Arthurian culture has spread far and wide in southern England, while the more rural center of England remains mostly loyal to the old culture. They all see each other as equals though, so there's no animosity about it. This is a realm of peace, religious tolerance, and combined Celtic, Brythonic, and Saxon values. There's a through line of steppe nomadism via the focus on horse pastures and a general respect for the horse and its usefulness. Guthfrith's rule would be suddenly ended when the plague struck him down in February of 1199, putting the realm into the hands of his son, Thragan, and this is where we'll end things off. The fate of Alba is something which time will tell one day, but right now it's looking like a very powerful combination of the fierce steppe nomad military acumen and legendary Saxon willpower. The Normans thought they could tame the Saxons and subjugate them, but they forgot just how fierce these Germanics really are. After retreating to the steppe and building up some power, the Saxons came back with a vengeance, subjugating the Normans in the end and becoming much more powerful thanks to their eastern odyssey. The entire kingdom of France, by happenstance, has completely collapsed with the combined pressure from Iberia and England, which is certainly poetic justice for the Normans and their overconfidence. Reflecting on his lineage, High King Thragan considered that his people have been through much, and that he will never let them down, lest his ancestors' efforts have been for nothing. It may have taken a few generations, but the synthesis of steppe nomad life and settled life in England would create the ultimate kingdom. What a legend, this New England, and the eventual return to her roots. I hope you enjoyed this story. Thank you for your time.